There are kids today who've never heard of a balsa wood airplane. You're not one of those kids. You remember the smell of model cement on a Saturday morning. That sweet, sharp, chemical bite. The kind that sat in the kitchen all weekend and made your mother crack a window. The plans taped flat to the board. Pins everywhere. Tissue paper stretched tight. The rubber band motor wound so many turns it was starting to knot against itself. And you remember the crash, the crosswind. 3 weeks of work, folded into a fence post in 3 seconds. The crash isn't what this story is about, though. What came after is, you went back inside, you sat back down at that kitchen table, and you started over. That's the part of this story nobody tells. Balsa wood planes were everywhere once. Walk into any five and dime in America from the 1930s through the 1980s, and you'd find them. Yellow and blue kit boxes stacked against the back wall. Some for 50 cents, some for $1, some, if you'd saved from 2 weekends of mowing, for a couple of dollars more. They were the cheapest keys to the sky you could buy. And then they disappeared. Not overnight. They edged slowly to the back of the shelf, then out of the hobby shops, then out of the catalogs entirely. Until one day you walked into a store and the aisle where they used to be was all foam jets and battery-powered drones that flew straight out of the box. What happened? The answer's stranger than you'd think, and it involves something that has almost nothing to do with airplanes. But first, let's go back to when balsa was the most magical material on Earth. Balsa wood isn't like regular wood. Pick up a piece of it, an 1/8-inch sheet, the kind used for a wing panel, and your brain doesn't trust what your hand is telling it. It's lighter than it has any right to be. Hold a wing rib between 2 fingers, and you could blow it right off your palm. Balsa trees grow faster than almost any wood-producing tree in South America. Because they grow so fast, they never develop dense, heavy growth rings. Their cells fill with water instead. When the wood is kiln-dried, all that water evaporates. What's left is a structure that's nearly 90% air, light, and surprisingly strong for its weight. By 1926, a World War I Navy aviator named Paul K. Guillows had seen exactly what that wood could do for kids who loved planes. He started his company in a barn in Wakefield, Massachusetts, and called it New Craft Toys. Just 1 year later, Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic. The country went airplane crazy. Paul seized the moment and began shipping balsa kits, everything you needed to build something that could actually fly. You just had to do the work. You didn't buy an airplane, you bought the possibility of one. That distinction mattered. It meant from the moment you opened the box, you were already responsible for whether it flew. Guillows wasn't alone for long. Comet model airplane and supply out of Chicago came right behind them. Then Cleveland model and scientific models. By the 1950s, balsa kits were everywhere. The Sears catalog had them. The local drugstore had them. The hobby shop downtown had them. With an older guy behind the counter who could sight down a balsa sheet and tell you by the grain which pieces were worth buying. For under $2, any kid in America could become a pilot, an engineer, and a manufacturer all at once. Didn't matter if you were from Grosse Pointe or Gary, Indiana, the same yellow kit box was waiting on that shelf. This was the golden age, and all it asked of you was time. The promise cost one thing. Time. Serious, unyielding time. You started with the plans, a full-size blueprint of the entire airplane, printed on a wide sheet of paper. You taped it flat to a building board. Ceiling tile worked, drywall worked, then covered it with wax paper so the glue wouldn't stick. Then you pinned. Wing ribs, one at a time, spars, longerons. Each piece came from a die-cut sheet, pressed out with your thumbs, and if the grain wasn't right, the piece cracked right as it came free. A small heartbreak, right there at the kitchen table. You'd set it aside and reach for the next one. The glue had a smell that lived in your memory for decades. Model cement. Sweet, sharp, slightly toxic. The kind your mother recognized from 2 rooms away. You held each joint for a full minute before moving to the next. Rush it, and the joint would fail on first flight. You'd know exactly why. Patience wasn't a character trait you brought to the table. It was something the process forced out of you, joint by joint. Then the tissue paper. You stretched it across the completed frame, gently, because that wood was thin enough to snap, and brushed on the dope. Airplane dope. A lacquer with a smell even sharper than the cement. The kind that made your eyes water without a cracked window. As it dried, something happened. The tissue paper shrank. You could watch it in real time. A loose, wrinkled sheet pulling tight against the frame, becoming taut and drum-like. When it was right, you tapped it with one finger. It rang, thin and clear. That sound meant you'd done it right. The total build took anywhere from a long weekend to 3 weeks of evenings. You bled on it. X-Acto knife slips were so routine they barely registered. You got glue on the table and hoped it dried clear before your mom noticed. Nobody ever put this on the box. The building wasn't the price you paid to get to the flying. The building was the whole thing. Every hour you put in bonded you to that plane. When it finally lifted off the ground, you felt it in a way you'd never feel anything that came pre-built. You made it, completely yours. And the next morning, you'd carry it outside to find out if 3 weeks of work were about to mean something or become a pile of kindling. The maiden flight had a ritual. You carried the plane outside like you were carrying something sacred, because you were. You'd pick your spot, a park, a school field on a Saturday when nobody else was around. Somewhere open, with enough sky that a bad throw didn't end things immediately. You'd check the wind, wind the rubber band motor slowly, counting turns until you felt the torque building through the fuselage. Too few turns, not enough power. Too many, you'd snap the rubber band inside the plane. You held it up, nose into the wind, one breath, and then you threw it. When it worked, and sometimes it did, there was nothing in the world like it. The propeller bit in, the wings found lift. The plane banked gently, caught a thermal, and circled overhead. A whole minute. You'd stand there watching something you built with your own hands stay up in the actual sky. But most first flights weren't magic. Most were a crosswind, a bad throw, one wing rib not quite true. And 3 weeks of work came apart in about 3 seconds. Most kids went home, got the plans back out, started again. That's the part nobody puts in the instruction manual. The second build was faster and better. You knew where the tricky joints were, how much dope the tissue needed, exactly how many turns the motor could take. The crash didn't end anything. It moved you to the next level. That was the hidden lesson. The willingness to lose 3 weeks of work and treat it as information, not defeat. That's what the plane was actually teaching. There are generations of American men who learned that from a box of balsa and a sheet of plans. The question is, what happened to the world that raised boys that way? By the way, if this is hitting somewhere you didn't expect, this channel is where we go digging for stories like this one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The first real crack appeared in the early 2000s. The culprit wasn't video games or kids going indoors. It was foam. EPP, Dupron, expanded polystyrene. Different brands, different blends, but all built around the same idea. Planes that didn't splinter when they crashed. You could slam one nose first into a concrete wall, watch it bounce off, and fly it again immediately. No splinters, no kindling. Just a small dent on the nose. Easy to squeeze out with your thumb. The old-timers had a name for these new planes. Flying ice chests. It wasn't a compliment, but the new crowd didn't care. They were in the air on day one. That was the key shift. With a traditional balsa kit, you built for weeks before you ever flew. With a foam, almost ready to fly plane, you unboxed it Tuesday afternoon, charged the battery, and launched it before dinner. Crash it, fly it again in seconds. The barrier to entry didn't just go down, it disappeared. Then the electronics caught up. The Balsa crowd had run on nitro glow engines, greasy, loud, temperamental, needing a full field box of tools just to start. Electric brushless motors came in cheap, clean, and powerful. LiPo batteries got lighter every year. You didn't need a sturdy wooden airframe anymore. Foam was lighter on impact, easier to replace, and cheaper to mass produce. Tower Hobbies was the catalog. If you were building RC planes in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, that catalog was your Bible. Kits, engines, balsa sheeting, all shipped to your door when the hobby shop didn't carry it. In January 2018, Hobbico, Tower's parent company, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Horizon Hobby bought the RC assets for just under $19 million. Horizon's business was foam ready-to-fly planes. Wooden kits weren't where growth was heading. Independent shops were already shutting down. The guys who matched balsa grain by sight were retiring. Their buildings became nail salons and phone repair stores. Balsa survived as a niche, but the open market was gone. And then came the finishing blow. Something nobody in the hobby had seen coming. Something that had nothing to do with toys at all. A fact from around 2020 that still stops you cold. Balsa prices spiked hard. In about 15 months, the price of commercial balsa nearly tripled. Small kit manufacturers, the guys who'd survived the foam revolution, still laser-cutting precision kits for serious builders, suddenly couldn't source the wood. The supply had been consumed by wind turbines. A modern wind turbine blade can stretch over 200 feet from base to tip. Inside those blades, engineers needed a core material both incredibly light and strong enough to handle decades of stress and weather. They landed on balsa wood. Ecuador produces about 90% of the world's commercial balsa. Starting around 2019, the wind energy industry moved in hard. China was building turbines at a scale the world had never seen. Ecuador's balsa exports more than tripled in a single year. On one side of that market, small hobby companies needing a few thousand balsa sheets for model airplane kits. On the other, multi-billion-dollar energy conglomerates needing thousands of tons for turbine blade cores. There was no competition. The balsa was gone. Prices had nearly tripled. For manufacturers on thin margins, with foam eating their shelf space and their customer base already shrinking, this was the end. The same industry being built to power the future had consumed the raw materials of a childhood that was already disappearing. That's not opinion. That's what happened. Sit with that for a second. So here's where things stand today. Foam planes that bounce off walls. GPS drones that won't let you crash even if you try. Software correcting your mistakes before you make them. Toys built around one idea. Make sure nothing is ever really lost. And the balsa wood airplane, maddening and magnificent, is a niche hobby now. Kept alive in garage workshops by the men who never forgot what it felt like to build one. Guillows is still on Salem Street in Wakefield, Massachusetts. Still making kits, still sourcing balsa from Ecuador. They switched to laser cutting years ago. The pieces pop cleanly now instead of cracking under the old die-cut press. Consider this. This year, 2026, Guillows turns 100 years old. 100 years. From a World War I pilot cutting balsa in a barn, through the kit craze of the 50s and the RC revolution, past the foam takeover and a wind turbine shortage that nearly finished them. Still in Wakefield, still shipping kits. They're still there because the people who grew up building those planes never quite let them go. 100 years. The question underneath all of this isn't just what happened to balsa wood airplanes. You know that part now. Foam replaced them. Wind turbines consumed the supply. The hobby shops closed. What we lost is harder to name. The balsa wood airplane demanded something real from you. It made you bleed a little, breathe carefully, start over when things came apart. It taught you that you could put weeks of your life into something and lose it in 3 seconds, and that you'd survive that. We decided at some point that was too much to ask, that if a toy broke, that was a problem to fix. So the planes got made of foam. If they crashed, you flew them again. Nothing was ever really at stake. The rebuild was the lesson. It was always the lesson. Maybe it was kinder. The men who built those planes know what we traded. You might still have one, a box in the attic, a half-finished kit from 1974, the plane that hit the fence and never got rebuilt. The one you meant to go back to. Drop the name of the hobby shop or drugstore where you found your first kit in the comments. I want to know which one it was.